A healer accused of witchcraft, a cowboy with ghosts in his soul, a child with nowhere to belong. In the harsh wilderness of the American frontier, their lives collided in a battle against fear, prejudice, and the cruelty of small-minded men. But before the snow melted on the mountain, they would discover something stronger than violence, a family forged by compassion. If this Western tale inspired you, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe to ride with us into more unforgettable stories of the Wild West.
The dirt didn't judge, it just yielded. Martha Mattie Hayes pressed her bare hands into the cold Colorado soil. 38 years old, a widow for 3 of them. William was gone, taken by a winter cough that no root could cure, and since then, the town of Cedarwood mostly left her alone, usually. But this morning, the autumn air smelled like crushed sage, wood smoke, and trouble. Mattie pulled a bundle of yarrow from the earth. She shook the dirt from the roots. Her hands were calloused, rough. They weren't the hands of a delicate town lady. They were the hands of a woman who kept herself alive. She stood up, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. She looked down into the valley, down toward the town. Something was brewing. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a heavy, creeping dread. It started last night. Tommy Trenton, the mayor's 7-year-old boy, had been burning up. 3 days of fever, 3 days of sweating and shivering. Dr. Silas Vance had been at the boy's bedside the whole time. Silas was 55, proud, and completely out of ideas. Last night, he finally closed his black leather bag. He told the mayor to call the preacher. He told the mother to pray. But Mayor Trenton's wife didn't just pray. She ran through the dark, all the way to the edge of town, to the widow's cabin. She hammered on Mattie's door, crying, begging so. Mattie went. She didn't bring a black leather bag. She brought a woven basket. Inside were willow bark, dried feverfew, and roots she had pulled from the very soil she was standing on now. Dr. Vance had been furious when she walked into that bedroom. He called her an ignorant peasant. He told her to get out. But the Mayor West's wife stood between them, desperate like a trapped animal, and told the doctor to step back. Mattie went to work. She brewed the willow bark. She applied the cool poultices to the boy's chest and neck. She sat by the bed, watching his breathing, adjusting the herbs, hour after hour. By dawn, the fever broke. Tommy opened his eyes. He asked for water. It should have been a miracle. It should have been a moment of grace. But Mattie had seen the look in Dr. Vance's eyes as the sun came up. It wasn't relief. It was cold, hard humiliation. A man like Silas Vance couldn't stand being bested, especially not by a woman. Especially not by a widow who dug in the dirt. Now, standing in her garden, as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the pines, Mattie heard it. The sound of horses. She didn't run. She didn't hide in the cabin. She just stood there, her hands resting on her apron, and waited. They came up the mountain road. A mob of them. 17 men. They weren't strangers. That was the worst part. These were the men she bought flour from. Men who milled the lumber. Men who sat in the front pews of the church every Sunday. Now, they were a pack, and they had torches. The flames cut through the cooling autumn twilight. The horses stomped and snorted, kicking up dust at the edge of her wooden fence. Mayor Josiah Trenton was among them. He looked down at the pommel of his saddle. He couldn't meet her eyes, the man whose son she had just saved, too cowardly to stand up to the crowd. At the front of the pack rode Dr. Silas Vance. Vance pulled his horse up to the gate. He looked down at Mattie. His face was twisted with something ugly. "Martha Hayes," Vance called out. His voice echoed off the pines. Mattie didn't flinch. "State your business, Silas. It's getting late. I have herbs to dry." "We're here to put an end to this," Vance said. He pointed a gloved finger at her garden. at the bundles of sage hanging from her porch. No genuine medicine breaks a fever of that magnitude overnight. Not the way you did it. He was dying, Maddie said, her voice steady. Now he is breathing. You're welcome. It's unnatural, Vance shouted, turning his horse slightly so the crowd could hear him better. He was performing for them, feeding their fear. You gave that boy something unholy. That is dark magic. Witchcraft. And this town will not harbor a practitioner of the dark arts. We will burn this garden to the ground, and you will be gone by morning. A murmur rippled through the men. A few of them raised their torches. The wood crackled and hissed. Fear is a dry brush. It only takes one spark. Maddie looked at the flames. She looked at the faces of the men. She felt a tremor in her knees, a deep human terror. But she refused to let it show. She thought of William. She thought of the countless women before her, silenced, pushed into the dark, simply because they knew things men didn't understand. She stepped off the porch. She walked right up to the wooden fence, stopping just feet from Vance's horse. Look at me, Silas, Maddie said. Her voice wasn't a shout. It was a command. It cut right through the nervous shifting of the horses. Vance glared down at her. Healing is not magic, gentlemen, Maddie said. She spoke slowly, deliberately, making sure every single man in that mob heard every word. It is the science of the earth. You call it witchcraft. You call it the devil's work. But you only call it that because you are too proud to accept the truth. She pointed a finger straight at Dr. Vance. You cannot stomach the fact that a woman can use her intellect and nature's remedies to save a life that you had already abandoned. You cover your own incompetence with superstition. Women have carried the knowledge of roots and herbs for generations. It is science. It is skill. It is a right to care for the sick, and you will not brand me a monster just to protect a man's fragile pride. Silence fell over the yard. For a second, nobody moved. The words hung in the cold air, heavy and sharp. Maddie saw a flicker of doubt in the eyes of a few men in the back. They knew she was right. Deep down, they knew. But pride is a stubborn thing, and fear is louder than reason. Vance's face turned purple. His authority had been challenged in front of the whole town. He grabbed a torch from the man riding next to him. Burn it, Vance snarled. Burn the weeds. If she doesn't leave, we'll drag her out. He reared his arm back, ready to hurl the pitch-soaked torch straight into the dry brush of her front garden. Maddie braced herself. She closed her eyes. But the torch never left Vance's hand, because before Vance could throw it, the heavy metallic click of a Winchester rifle lever being racked echoed like a thunderclap through the quiet valley. You throw that, a deep, gravelly voice said from the shadows of the road, and I'll make sure you never use that arm again. The mob froze. Every head turned. A massive dark bay horse stepped out of the tree line, and on its back sat a man who looked like he had been carved straight out of the mountain itself. The click of that rifle lever was louder than a cannon in the quiet valley. 17 men froze. 17 pairs of eyes shifted from the widow to the road. He rode out of the shadows. The horse was a massive dark bay, thick-chested and mean-looking. But the man at its back was what held the crowd. He was big, broad across the shoulders. He wore a coat of faded buckskin, scarred by branches and weather. A thick beard hid the lower half of his face, but his eyes caught the torchlight. They were gray, cold as a frozen pond. He held the Winchester resting across the pommel of his saddle. Casual, but his finger was inside the trigger guard. Maddie didn't know him. She'd have seen him maybe once or twice a year, loading flour and bullets at the general store. A mountain man, a ghost who only came down when the snow melted. Dr. Vance lowered the torch, just an inch, but it was enough. "This doesn't concern you, Boone," Vance said. His voice had lost that booming, theatrical edge. Now it just sounded tight, nervous. "This is town business." Elias Boone didn't look at Vance. He looked at Mattie. He took his time. He looked at the way she stood, straight and unblinking. He looked at the dirt on her apron. He looked at the mob crowding her fence. "Town business," Elias said. His voice was low. It rumbled in his chest, carrying easily over the snorting horses. "Looks like a lynching to me. 17 grown men cornering a widow over a boy says fever." Mayor Trenton finally found his spine. He nudged his horse forward a half step. "She practices witchcraft, Boone. She used unnatural means on my son. We are driving her out." Elias spat into the dirt. "She saved your boy," Elias said flatly. "I heard the talk at the saloon 10 minutes ago." "You gave up on him, Mayor. The doctor here gave up on him." "She didn't." Elias nudged his big bay horse forward. The crowd parted. They didn't want to, but they did. The bay stopped right at the wooden gate, putting Elias directly between Mattie and the mob. He looked down at her. "You the healer?" he asked. "I am an herbalist," Mattie said. Her voice didn't shake. "I use plants. Not magic. Can you cure the shivering sickness? The one that comes in waves, burns a body up, then freezes it solid." Mattie blinked. "Malaria. Ague. I can treat it. Yes. If I have the right bark." Elias nodded once. Slow, deliberate. He turned his head slightly, looking back at Vance. "You want her? Gone." "By morning," Vance snapped, gaining a little courage back. "Or we burn the cabin." Elias looked back at Mattie. "I have a proposition for you, ma'am. You don't have to take it, but if you don't, I figure you'll be sleeping in the cold tonight." Mattie narrowed her eyes. "What proposition?" "Me," said. Just like that. 2 words, dropped into the night air like stones in a quiet pond. The crowd gasped. Somebody muttered a curse. Mattie just stared at him. She thought she hadn't heard him right. "Excuse me," she said. "Marry me," Elias repeated. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't joking. He was doing math in his head. "Right here, on paper, in front of the town. I got a cabin up on the ridge. Good land. You'll have a roof. And nobody in this valley will ever raise a hand to the wife of Elias Boone." Mattie's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at his scarred hands. She looked at the cold gray of his eyes. He wasn't a knight in shining armor. He was a stranger, a wild man. But he was offering her a shield. "Why?" Mattie asked. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Because I need a healer, and you need a wall." Mattie looked past him. She saw Vance. She saw the torches. She knew the law of the West. A mob could run a single woman out of town without a second thought. But a married woman, a woman legally bound to an armed man, that was a different story. That crossed a legal line that even a mob hesitated to cross. She took a slow breath. "All right," Mattie said. "I accept." Uproar broke out. The men started shouting. "You can't do this, Boone," Vance yelled. He spurred his horse forward, pointing the torch. "She is a menace. She is a witch. I won't allow this charade to protect her." Elias shifted his grip on the Winchester. The barrel swung up, just an inch. The shouting stopped dead. Elias looked at Vance. The mountain man's face was carved from granite. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. "You listen to me, Silas Vance," Elias said. Every word was sharp, deliberate. "Ignorance, and you listen good, do not give you the right to strip away a woman's life or her dignity." Elias shifted his gaze, sweeping over the mayor and the rest of the men. "A woman's mind is not a crime," Elias stated, his voice ringing loud and clear. "You men get scared when a woman knows something you don't. You try to burn her out to make yourselves feel tall. But women aren't property. They aren't yours to punish just because They understand the earth better than you do. From this second on, she is the lawful wife of Elias Boone. The laws of the United States protect my household. Any man who crosses this fence, any man who touches a single leaf in her garden, will have to argue his case with my rifle. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind blew through the pines. A horse stamped its hoof. Vance S.'s face was pale. He looked at the rifle. He looked at Elias S.'s eyes. He knew Boone wasn't bluffing. Elias Boone had killed men in the war. Everyone knew that. "This isn't over," Vance hissed, but he pulled his horse back. "It is for tonight," Elias said. "Go home." Nobody argued. Mayor Trenton turned his horse first. The rest followed. They were tired. The adrenaline was fading. And nobody wanted to be the first man shot over a widow's herb garden. Within 5 minutes, the road was empty. The torches were gone. Only the smell of smoke lingered in the air. Elias lowered the rifle. He slid it back into the leather scabbard on his saddle. He swung down from the horse. He was even taller on the ground. He walked up to the gate. Maddie stood her ground. "You meant it," she said. "I don't say things I don't mean," Elias replied. "Pack your things. We're riding to the justice of the peace in the next county over tomorrow. Tonight, we ride up the mountain." "I have a condition," Maddie said. She lifted her chin. She wasn't going to cower. "Not to the mob, not to him." Elias crossed his arms. "Name it. I go with you. I help whoever it is that is sick. But every root, every seed, every book I own." Elias looked past her. He looked at the bundles hanging from the rafters. He looked at the neatly tilled rows in the dirt. "It's going to take a big wagon," Elias said. "I have a cart," Maddie told him, "and a mule." A muscle twitched in Elias's jaw. It might have been a smile. It was hard to tell under the beard. "Then hitch the mule, Mrs. Boone," he said. We got a long ride up in the dark. The ride up the ridge was brutal. The trail was nothing but rocks and switchbacks. The cold bit through Maddie S.'s wool coat. The mule protested every step, dragging the heavy wooden cart filled with her lifeless work. Glass jars clinked. Dried leaves rustled. Elias rode ahead on his big bay. He didn't talk. He didn't look back. But Maddie noticed the small things. She noticed how he took the wide path to avoid a rut that would jar her cart. She noticed how he stopped at the creek, letting her mule drink before his own horse. He was a hard man, but he wasn't a careless one. They reached the cabin well past midnight. It sat on a flat shelf of rock, surrounded by towering ponderosa pines. The moon was bright enough to show its shape. It wasn't a shack. It was a proper, sturdy cabin built from thick, peeled logs. Tight joints, a stone chimney smoking softly into the night sky. There was a barn out back. It was built to survive. "Whoa," Elias murmured, stepping down. Maddie halted the mule. Her hands were frozen to the reins. She was exhausted. Her bones ached. But her mind was spinning. She had just left everything she knew. She had just promised herself to a stranger. Elias walked over and unhitched the mule. "Go inside," he said. "Fire's spanked, but it's warm. I'll stable the animals." Maddie climbed down. Her legs wobbled. She pushed the heavy oak door open. The heat hit her first. The smell hit her second. It smelled like wood smoke, like old leather and coffee. But underneath that, there was a sharp, sour smell. The smell of old sweat. The smell of sickness. She walked toward the back of the single large room. There was a small alcove, separated by a thick woolen blanket hung from a rope. Maddie pushed the blanket aside. A small cot sat against the wall. On it lay a boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 years old. He was curled into a tight ball, shivering so hard the wooden cot rattled against the floorboards. His skin was pale, slick with sweat. His lips were a pale, bruised blue. Maddie forgot the cold. She forgot the mob. She forgot the man in the barn. She dropped her coat on the floor and went to work. She touched his forehead. He was burning up, but his body was freezing. Ag. Malaria. It was a vicious cycle. The fever baked the brain and the chills racked the bones. The cabin door opened behind her. A gust of cold wind blew in, then cut off as the door shut. Elias walked in. He carried a saddlebag over his shoulder. He stopped at the edge of the blanket, watching her. "How long?" Maddie asked. She didn't look back at him. She was already unbuttoning her cuffs, rolling up her sleeves. "2 weeks," Elias said. His voice was tired. "It comes and goes. 2 days bad. 1 day fine. Now it's just bad. He hasn't eaten since Tuesday." "I need boiling water," Maddie ordered, "and my blue satchel from the cart." Elias didn't argue. He turned and went back out into the cold. Maddie pulled the heavy quilts up over the boy's shoulders. "Shh," she whispered. "It's all right, little one. It's all right." The boy didn't open his eyes. He just let out a ragged, dry cough. Elias came back. He set the blue satchel on the table and went straight to the cast-iron stove, stoking the coals and setting a kettle on top. Maddie opened the satchel. She pulled out a small glass jar filled with coarse, reddish-brown bark, cinchona bark. It was rare. It was expensive, and it was the only thing that could kill the parasite in the boy's blood. She took a mortar and pestle from the bag. She started grinding. Elias leaned against the wooden counter. He watched her hands. "We need rules," Elias said quietly over the grinding sound of the pestle. Maddie didn't stop grinding. "Go on." "That room back there," Elias pointed to a closed timber door near the stove. "That's yours. It has a heavy latch on the inside. You use it. I sleep out here by the fire." Maddie paused. She looked at him. "I won't ever ask for a husband's rights," Elias said. He looked her right in the eye. "No shame, no hesitation. This was a trade. My protection for your medicine. I keep my word. You're safe here." Maddie felt a knot in her chest loosen. A knot she hadn't realized was pulled so tight. "I appreciate that," she said. She went back to the bark. The kettle began to hiss. "Elias," Maddie said, using his first name for the first time. "Who is he?" Elias looked at the boy on the cot. The hard lines around his eyes softened, just a fraction. "His name is Sam," Elias said. "I found him wandering the timber line 3 weeks ago. His daddy was a trapper, drunk. Mean got himself mauled by a grizzly before the snow fell. Boy was just sitting by the ruined camp, freezing to death." Maddie poured the boiling water into a tin cup. She sprinkled the powdered bark into the water. The smell was sharp and bitter. "You took him in," Maddie said. "A stranger's child. I couldn't leave him." Maddie stirred the medicine. She turned around to face the big mountain man. "The town doctor wouldn't have gone out of his way for a trapper's orphan," Maddie said softly. "The mayor wouldn't have let him in his house. They would say he wasn't their responsibility, that he had no standing." Elias pushed himself off the counter. He walked over to the cot, looking down at the shivering boy. "The town is full of fools," Elias said. His voice was heavy with conviction. He looked back at Maddie. "Compassion doesn't require a birth certificate or shared blood, Maddie. It doesn't matter who his father was. It doesn't matter if he has a dime to his name. He is a human being." Elias reached out, his massive calloused hand gently brushing a damp lock of hair from Sam's forehead. "Every human being," Elias continued, his words ringing with a quiet, fierce morality, "no matter how poor, no matter how abandoned, has a fundamental right to live. They have a right to care. A civilized man doesn't step over a dying child just because it's not his own flesh. We owe each other basic humanity. Period." Maddie stood still. She held the tin cup of bitter medicine. She had spent 3 years in Cedarwood, 3 years listening to men in fine suits preach about charity on Sundays, only to turn their backs on the poor on Mondays. She had just been run out of her home by a doctor who cared more about his pride than a patient. And here, in a cabin on a jagged ridge, a man dressed in dirty buckskin was speaking the truest words she had heard in a decade. "You're a good man, Elias Boone," Maddie said quietly. Elias looked away. He pulled his hand back from the boy's head. "I'm just a man. Get that medicine in him." Maddie moved to the cot. She sat on the edge. "Help me lift him," she said. Elias moved behind the boy. He slid his large hands under Sam's shoulders, lifting him up gently. The boy was dead weight. Maddie brought the tin cup to Sam's dry lips. "Drink, Sam," she whispered. "It's bitter, I know, but it's going to save you. Drink." Sam moaned. He didn't want it. But Maddie was patient. She tipped the cup, letting the warm, bitter liquid slide into his mouth. He swallowed, then coughed, swallowed again. It took 20 minutes to get half the cup down. When they were done, Elias laid the boy back down onto the pillow. "Now what?" Elias asked. "Now," Maddie said, pulling the quilts tight, "we wait. The bark will fight the fever. But he's weak. He'll sweat. We have to keep him warm, and we have to keep pouring water into him." Elias nodded. "I'll get more wood for the stove." He turned toward the door. "Elias," Maddie called out. He stopped, his hand on the iron latch. He looked back. Maddie looked around the cabin. It was rough. It was bare. But the fire was warm, and the man standing by the door had just put a rifle between her and a mob. "There's good soil on the south side of this ridge," Maddie said. "I saw it in the moonlight on the ride up." Elias nodded slowly. "Sun hits it first thing in the morning. Snow melts fast there. I want to put my garden there," Maddie said. "It's hard dirt," Elias warned, "full of rocks." "I don't mind hard work," Maddie replied, "but I'll need help clearing the heavy stones." Elias Boone looked at the woman sitting by the cot. He saw the dirt on her dress. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes. But he also saw the steel in her spine. "First light," Elias said. "We start digging." He opened the door and walked out into the cold mountain night. Maddie sat alone in the quiet cabin. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the ragged breathing of the sick child. She reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small, dried leaf of sage. She rolled it between her thumb and forefinger, breathing in the sharp, clean scent. Her life in the valley was gone, burned away by fear and ignorance. But up here, where the air was thin and the rules were simple, she felt something strange taking root in her chest. She was safe, and for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't alone. The fever broke on the morning of the third day. It didn't retreat slowly. It broke like a summer storm 1 minute. The boy was shivering, shaking the wooden cot. The next, he went entirely still. Maddie was sitting in the chair beside him. Her eyes were red. Her back ached from sleeping in a hard wooden chair. She leaned forward, holding her breath. Sam's chest rose. It fell. A long, deep sigh escaped his dry lips. The harsh, shallow panting was gone. The unnatural heat radiating from his skin faded, replaced by a cool, clammy sweat. Maddie closed her eyes. She let out a breath. She felt like she'd been holding since she rode up the mountain. Elias was at the stove. He was pouring coffee. He stopped. He set the metal pot down with a dull clink. "Is he gone?" Elias asked. His voice was thick, rough. "No," Maddie said softly. "He's sleeping, really sleeping. The parasite is dying." Elias stood there for a long moment. He looked at the boy. Then he looked at Maddie. He didn't to smile. He didn't to cheer. But the heavy, dark shadow that had been hanging over his shoulders seemed to lift. Just a little. "I'll get the pickaxe," Elias said. "We have a garden to dig." The south face of the ridge was bathed in morning light. But the light was deceptive. It looked warm. It felt like ice. The dirt was stubborn. It had been packed down by centuries of snow and wind. It was full of gray mountain rock, tangled with thick, stubborn pine roots. It was wild land. It didn't want to be tamed. Elias swung the heavy iron pickaxe high over his head. It came down with a sharp crack biting into the earth. Sparks flew as iron struck granite. He grunted, prying a stone the size of a melon from the dirt. He tossed it aside. He had been swinging for 2 hours. He hadn't stopped for water. He hadn't complained. He just worked methodical, relentless. Maddie was right behind him. She wore a thick canvas apron over her wool dress. Her hands were caked in dark soil. Where Elias broke the ground, she followed with a heavy iron hoe. She chopped the clods of dirt. She pulled the severed roots. She smoothed the soil, preparing a bed. They worked in a rhythm, a silent agreement. Crack, pry, toss, chop, pull. Smooth. The sun climbed higher. The frost melted off the pine needles, dripping down onto the newly turned earth. The smell of wet dirt and crushed pine filled the air. It smelled like a beginning. Maddie knelt in the dirt. She pulled a small canvas pouch from her apron pocket. She untied the leather string. Inside were hundreds of tiny dark seeds. Elias stopped. He leaned on the long hickory handle of his pickaxe. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his leather glove. He was breathing hard. He watched her. "What are those?" he asked. "Echinacea," Maddie said. "Cone flower. You plant them before the ground freezes solid. They sleep under the snow. The winter cold actually helps crack the seed coat. Come spring, they'll push up through the mud." Elias looked at the tiny specks in her hand. Then he looked at the brutal, rocky soil he had just busted his back to break open. "Hard to believe something that small can survive out here," Elias muttered. "Ground's unforgiving." Mattie carefully placed a seed into the dirt. She covered it with a thin layer of soil. She pressed it down firmly with her thumb. She paused. She looked up at him. "It's not about forgiveness, Elias," Mattie said. She brushed the dirt from her palms. She stayed kneeling, looking up at the towering mountain man. "It's about fairness." Elias frowned. "Ain't nothing fair about a mountain winter." "No," Mattie agreed, "but the dirt is." She reached out, grabbing a handful of the freshly tilled soil. She held it out. "Do you see this, Elias?" Mattie said. Her voice was clear. It cut through the thin mountain air. It wasn't just a conversation about farming. It was a lesson. She needed him to understand exactly how she saw the world. Nature treats us all as equals. This plant right here, it doesn't ask any questions. It doesn't ask if the sick man lying in the bed is a wealthy mayor with a big house or a ragged orphan boy with nothing to his name. Elias listened. He didn't interrupt. He kept his eyes on her face. "It doesn't care if the hands planting it belong to a man or a woman," Mattie continued, her voice rising with quiet conviction. "It doesn't care about the laws in the town hall. It doesn't care about a doctor's bruised pride. The seed only asks for water, dirt, and time. If you give it what it needs, it gives you medicine. It does its duty." She dropped the dirt. She dusted her hands off. "Men down in that valley build fences," Mattie said. "They make rules about who is worthy of respect, who is worthy of learning, who is worthy of a doctor's time. They let their prejudice decide who lives and who gets chased out with a torch." She looked straight into Elias's gray eyes. "If society could learn basic fairness from the dirt we walk on, Elias, the world would suffer a lot fewer mobs with torches. We are all made of the same flesh. We all bleed the same blood, and we all deserve the same right to heal. The earth knows that. It's a shame men refuse to learn it." Elias stood perfectly still. The wind blew through the pines, a low, rushing sound. He didn't brush her words off. He didn't nod absent-mindedly. He turned her words over in his head. He weighed them. He measured them against his own life, against the men who had left him to die in a silver mine 15 years ago, against the men who had shown up at her gate last night. He looked at the small patch of turned earth. "Town's got a lot of rules," Elias finally said. His voice was soft, grating. "Rules made by little men trying to cast a big shadow." He lifted the pickaxe. He looked at the next patch of unbroken ground. "We don't live in town anymore," he said. He swung the pickaxe down. Crack. Maddie smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. She moved down the row, planting the next seed. They worked until the sun went down. When they walked back into the cabin that night, their boots heavy with mud, they found Sam sitting up in bed. He was weak. His hands trembled, but his eyes were clear. He looked at Maddie. Then he looked at Elias. "I'm hungry," the boy croaked. Elias stopped in his tracks. He stared at the boy. Then a slow, genuine grin broke through his thick beard. It changed his whole face. He didn't look like a wild man anymore. He looked like a father. "I'll heat the broth," Maddie said, softly. Elias nodded. "I'll fetch more wood." It was a simple exchange. But in that small, warm cabin, surrounded by miles of freezing wilderness, it felt like a victory. The trouble didn't come with torches this time. It came quietly, sneaking up the mountain like a coyote, looking for a sick calf. It was mid-morning, 4 days after they planted the echinacea. The air was crisp. The sky was a hard, piercing blue. Maddie was on the front porch, grinding dried mint leaves in a stone mortar. Sam was sitting on the wooden steps, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. He was whittling a piece of soft pine with a dull knife Elias had given him. He was getting stronger every day. Then the dog barked. Ellis had a mutt, half wolf, half hound. It lived in the barn, mostly, but it knew its job. The dog trotted out to the edge of the tree line, teeth bared, letting out a low, vibrating growl. Elias stepped out of the barn. He held a pitchfork. He didn't run. He just walked to the center of the yard and waited. A horse emerged from the pines. The rider was Caleb Judd. Caleb was a weasel of a man. Thin, greasy hair, wearing a suit that was 2 sizes too big and a bowler hat covered in trail dust. He worked for Mayor Trenton. He was the kind of man who did the town's dirty work so the mayor could keep his hands clean. Caleb pulled his horse up. He looked nervous. He kept glancing at Elias's pitchfork. Then he looked at Maddie on the porch. His eyes flicked to the drying herbs, to the jars, to the boy. He was taking inventory, looking for a weakness. "Boone," Caleb said, tipping his hat. It was a fake gesture. "Mrs. Boone." "You're off your trail, Caleb," Elias said. He didn't lower the pitchfork. "Town's a long way down." "Just taking a ride," Caleb said, forcing an oily smile. "Mayor Trenton sent me to check on you folks. See how the newlyweds are settling in. Make sure the little lady hasn't poisoned you yet." Elias didn't smile back. "I'm fine. She's fine. You can turn around now." "Now, Elias, no need to be hostile," Caleb said, sliding off his horse. He took a few steps toward the porch. He was looking at the mortar in Maddie's hands. "The doctor is just concerned, is all. If someone up here were to die from consuming unproven weeds, well, the town would have to press charges. Manslaughter. Law's the law." Maddie stopped grinding. She looked Caleb dead in the eye. "If someone dies up here, Caleb, it'll be from freezing," Maddie said coldly. "Or from trespassing. Not from my medicine." Caleb sneered. He opened his mouth to snap back, but a sound from the tree line cut him off. It wasn't a horse. It was the sound of snapping branches, heavy footsteps, frantic. The hound barked again, running toward the woods. 3 figures stumbled out of the dense pine forest. Maddie stood up. dropping the pestle. It was a family. Cheyenne, a man, broad-chested and desperate, was carrying a girl in his arms. She was maybe 14. A woman walked beside them, her face pale, holding a blood-soaked blanket over the girl's leg. They were exhausted. Their clothes were torn by briars. They had been walking for a long time. The man stopped when he saw Elias. He looked at the pitchfork. He looked at Caleb. Then he looked past them, locking eyes with Maddie on the porch. "Healer," the Cheyenne man said. His English was broken, heavy with exhaustion. He took a step forward. "Please, my daughter. The horse fell. Bone is broken, very bad, hot with sickness." Maddie didn't hesitate. She didn't think about Caleb. She didn't think about the town. She ran off the porch. "Bring her inside," Maddie shouted, pointing to the cabin door. "Elias, get the fire roaring. I need boiling water." "Now." Elias dropped the pitchfork. He ran for the door, holding it open, as the Cheyenne man carried his daughter inside. But Caleb Judd stepped in front of Maddie. He grabbed her arm. His grip was bony and tight. "What are you doing?" Caleb hissed. His face was twisted with disgust. "Are you out of your mind, woman? They're savages!" Maddie stopped. She looked down at Caleb's hand on her arm. Then she looked up at his face. "Let go of me," she said. Her voice was deadly quiet. "If you treat them, the town will hang you," Caleb warned, his voice rising in panic. "The mayor won't stand for it. Dr. Vance won't stand for it. You bring Indians into your house, you treat them like equals, you're signing your own death warrant." "They aren't our kind." Maddie ripped her arm out of his grip. She didn't slap him. She didn't scream. She used her words like a hammer. She wanted Caleb to hear her. She wanted the mayor to hear her. She wanted the whole damn valley to hear her. "You listen to me, Caleb Judd," Maddie said, her voice echoing off the timber walls of the cabin. "Pain does not discriminate by the color of a person's skin. Sickness doesn't check a man's pedigree before it takes root, and neither does my compassion." Caleb stepped back, stunned by the sheer force of her anger. "That is a child bleeding to death in my cabin," Maddie continued, stepping toward him, forcing him to retreat another step. "The right to medical care is a God-given human right. It is not a privilege handed out by the frightened, racist men in your town hall. It is not a reward for having white skin or a fat wallet." She pointed a finger hard into Caleb's chest. "A healer's duty is to the wounded," she stated firmly. "All the wounded. I don't care where they come from. I don't care what language they pray in. If they are bleeding, I will bind their wounds. If they are sick, I will treat them. Because they are human beings, Caleb. And their lives have the exact same value as yours." Caleb opened his mouth, stammering. You can't. "Get off my mountain," Maddie ordered. Before Caleb could say another word, the heavy wooden door of the cabin swung open. Elias stood in the doorway. He held his Winchester rifle. He wasn't pointing it at Caleb, but he was holding it loosely in his right hand. "You heard my wife," Elias said. His voice was low, like the rumble of an approaching avalanche. "Mount up, Caleb, ride down and tell the mayor that if he sends another dog to sniff around my property, I'll send it back without teeth." Caleb looked at the rifle. He looked at Elias' dead eyes. He didn't say a word. He scrambled onto his horse, yanked the reins hard, and spurred the animal down the trail. He didn't look back. Maddie watched him go until he disappeared into the pines. Her heart was racing. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline, from fury. Elias stepped off the porch. He walked up beside her. He looked down the empty trail. "You just made an enemy of the whole town," Elias said quietly. "I know," Maddie replied. "They won't forget this. Vance will use it against you. Let him." Maddie turned to look at Elias. I meant every word I said. I won't turn away a dying child to appease a bunch of cowards. Elias looked at her. He studied her face, the fierce set of her jaw, the blazing fire in her eyes. He nodded slowly. Good, Elias said. He turned back toward the cabin. Water's boiling. The girl's leg looks bad. Let's get to work. Maddie followed him inside. The fight with the town was coming. She knew it. Caleb would spread his poison. The mayor would scheme. Vance would plot. But right now, there was a girl bleeding on the table. There was a bone to set. There was medicine to brew. Maddie washed her hands in the steaming basin. She looked at the Cheyenne mother, who was crying silently in the corner. Maddie offered her a gentle, reassuring nod. She picked up her instruments. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. She felt like a doctor, and she wasn't hiding anymore. The winter came fast. It didn't announce itself, it just arrived. One evening, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. By morning, the world was white. The pines sagged under the weight. The trail down to Cedarwood vanished. They were cut off, completely. The Cheyenne family had left 3 days before the snow hit. The girl's fever was gone. The bone was set straight. The father had offered Elias a hunting knife with a carved bone handle in trade. Elias refused it. Maddie accepted a small, beaded pouch from the mother instead. It was a quiet parting, but it meant something. Now the cabin felt smaller, tighter. Sam was sitting on the rug by the iron stove, tracing shapes in the frost on the window pane. He was gaining weight. The hollows in his cheeks were filling out. He was a quiet boy, but he watched everything. Elias was at the wooden table. He was repairing a broken bridle. The leather was stiff from the cold. He needed an awl. He stood up, walking over to the small wooden shelf near Maddie's door where she kept some of her tools. He moved a stack of folded linen. Underneath it was a book. It was thick, bound in dark, worn leather. The edges of the pages were yellowed. It didn't look like a Bible. It looked heavy with use. Elias didn't mean to pry. But the book fell open as he shifted the linen. He stopped. He stared down at the open page. It wasn't a book of spells. It wasn't a diary of town gossip. It was a drawing, an incredibly detailed sketch of a plant. Every leaf, every vein, every root was rendered in precise dark ink. Beside the drawing were columns of text, small, neat handwriting. But Elias couldn't read a word of it. The letters were strange, sharp. It was German. He reached out. He picked the book up. He turned the page. Another drawing. Foxglove. He recognized the shape of the bell-like flowers. Next to it were measurements, numbers, fractions. He turned another page, then another. Page after page of botanical science, observations, dosages, symptoms, and remedies. He was holding a lifetime of work. The door to the cabin clicked open. A blast of cold air swept in, scattering a few loose ashes from the stove. Maddie stepped inside, carrying a basket of firewood. Her cheeks were flush from the cold. She kicked the door shut. She looked up. She saw Elias standing by the shelf. She saw the book in his hands. She froze. The basket of wood slipped an inch in her grip. In the town below, finding a book written in a foreign language with strange symbols and plant drawings would be a death sentence. It was the exact proof Dr. Vance and Mayor Trenton were looking for. Elias didn't yell. He didn't drop the book. He just looked at her. I was looking for the awl, he said. His voice was calm, flat. Maddie set the firewood down on the stone hearth. Slowly, she wiped her hands on her apron. She didn't look away from him. It belonged to my mother, Maddie said. She brought it over from Bavaria. I filled the rest of it in. Elias looked back down at the intricate drawing of the foxglove. You drew these? He asked. Yes. They look like the books the university men brought out west when they surveyed the land. Exact. He closed the heavy leather cover. He didn't hand it to her. He held it. You aren't just a woman who knows a few weeds, Maddie. This is a doctor's book. Maddie walked over to the table. She sat down. She looked suddenly very tired. A doctor's book? She echoed. She let out a short, bitter laugh. If I took that book down to Dr. Vance's office, he would throw it in the fireplace. He wouldn't even look at the ink. Elias pulled out a chair and sat across from her. He set the book gently on the table between them. Why? Elias asked. Maddie folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the worn grain of the wood. Then she looked up. Her eyes were sharp, fierce. Because of who wrote it, Maddie said, her voice hardening. This society strips women of the right to a formal medical education, Elias. They closed the doors of the universities to us. They say our minds are too fragile. They say we lack stomach for blood and science. She leaned forward. She wasn't just talking to him. She was stating a truth she had carried for a decade. Do you know what I did during the war? She asked. Elias shook his head. I was 22, Maddie said. My husband, William, enlisted. He was sent to a field hospital in Missouri. Shrapnel in his shoulder. It wasn't the metal that was killing him. It was the infection, the gangrene. The hospital was a butcher shop. The doctors were amputating limbs just to save time. She reached out and rested her hand on the leather cover of her journal. I wanted to help. I wanted to learn how to save him, Maddie continued. But the Army didn't let women near the operating tables. They didn't let us read the medical charts. So, I took the only job they would give a woman. I became a cleaner. Elias stayed perfectly still. He was listening, really listening. I scrubbed the blood off the floorboards, Maddie said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I hauled the amputated limbs to the fire pits. I carried the bloody rags. And while I was on my hands and knees, scrubbing their floors, I listened. I watched the surgeons. I memorized their mistakes. I watched what worked and what killed. I went out into the woods, behind the camp at night, and I tested the routes my mother taught me. I wrote it all down in this book. She tapped the cover. I saved William's arm, she stated. I saved his life. I did it with a willow bark wash and a comfrey poultice. When the chief surgeon saw William recovering, he didn't ask what I did. He told me to get back to mopping the floor. Maddie sat back. The anger in her chest was burning bright now. She didn't try to hide it. They forbid us because they fear we might be better at it than they are, Maddie declared, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. They keep the knowledge locked away to protect their own power. But I refuse to be blind. I choose to use my knowledge to preserve life, rather than sit quietly and wait for justice from men in white coats. My mind is not a crime, and neither is my medicine. Silence filled the cabin. Sam had stopped playing by the stove. He was watching them with wide eyes. Elias looked at the book. He looked at the rough, calloused hands of the woman sitting across from him. Hands that had scrubbed blood. Hands that had planted seeds in frozen dirt. He didn't offer empty pity. He didn't tell her it was unfair. He knew the world was unfair. Instead, Elias pushed the book across the table toward her. You're a doctor, Maddie, Elias said. His voice was a low, steady rumble. I don't care what the men in town say. I don't care what the Army said. The proof is in the boy sleeping by the fire. The proof is in the Cheyenne girl who walked out of here on her own two legs. Maddie looked at him. The tightness in her chest finally broke. A small, ragged breath escaped her lips. You don't think it's unnatural? She asked quietly. I think pride is unnatural, Elias replied. I think letting folks die because you're too proud to let a woman hold the knife is the real crime. He stood up. He picked up the broken bridle and his awl. He paused, looking back down at her. I got my own ghosts, Maddie, Elias said softly. Things I ran away from, things that still keep me up at night. Everybody's carrying something heavy. You carry a book. I carry something else. But we don't have to carry them alone up here. He turned and walked toward the door. Maddie sat at the table for a long time after he left. She rested her hands on her mother's journal. For years, she had hidden it. She had buried her intelligence under a quiet, polite smile. She had let men like Dr. Vance talk down to her because survival meant staying invisible. But Elias Boone had just looked at her fire, and instead of trying to put it out, he had handed her another log. She opened the book. She grabbed her pen, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel like she was writing in secret. The blizzard hit 2 weeks later. It didn't fall from the sky. It drove in sideways, howling like a wounded animal. The wind rattled the heavy logs of the cabin. The temperature dropped so fast, the moisture on the window panes froze into thick, opaque ice within an hour. It was pitch black by 3 in the afternoon. Elias had been out in the barn since noon. Maddie was inside, keeping the fire stoked and reading with Sam. The boy was practicing his letters on a slate board. Maddie looked at the door. Elias should have been back. The woodpile inside the barn was fully stocked. There was no reason for him to be out in this freezing whiteout for 3 hours. A sharp sense of unease settled in her gut. She stood up. She grabbed her heavy wool coat. She wrapped a thick scarf around her neck and pulled on her leather gloves. Sam, Maddie said firmly, stay by the stove. Do not open that door for anything unless you hear my voice, understand? The boy nodded, his eyes wide. Maddie unlatched the door and pushed. The wind nearly knocked her backward. It was a solid wall of freezing air and blinding snow. The cold punched the breath right out of her lungs. She lowered her head, shielding her face with her arm, and waded into the drift. The barn was only 50 yards away, but it felt like a mile. The snow was up to her thighs. She followed the rope Elias had strung between the cabin porch and the barn door for exactly this reason. She reached the heavy wooden door, heaved it open, and slipped inside. The barn was dark. The wind screamed against the roof, but inside it was quiet. The smell of sweet hay and horse sweat was thick in the air. Elias, Maddie called out. Back here, a voice grunted. She hurried down the center aisle. A single lantern hung from a nail near the last stall. Elias was on his knees in the straw. He had his heavy coat off. His sleeves were rolled up. His arms were covered in blood and dark, sticky fluid. Lying on her side in the straw was the big bay mare. The horse was panting hard, her eyes rolling back in her head. She let out a low, agonizing groan. She went into labor early, Elias said. He didn't look up. His face was pale, sweating despite the freezing cold. It's a bad presentation, breech. The foal is turned around. Back legs first, it's stuck. Maddie stripped her coat off. She threw it over a stall door. She didn't know much about veterinary medicine, but she knew birth. She knew anatomy. She knew panic. How long? She asked, kneeling down in the straw beside him. An hour, Elias breathed out. She's exhausted. If I don't get the foal turned, they're both going to die. He reached inside the mare again, his face twisting in concentration and effort. The horse thrashed, kicking her front hooves weakly against the wooden wall. Hold her head, Elias ordered. Keep her calm. If she stands up now, it's over. Maddie moved to the horse's head. She knelt in the muck. She placed her hands firmly on the mare's thick neck, stroking the damp coat. She leaned in close to the horse's ear. Easy now, Girl, Maddie murmured. Her voice was a low, steady rhythm. Easy. We're here. Just breathe. Elias strained. The muscles in his back tightened like coiled ropes. I can't get a grip, he grunted, frustration bleeding into his voice. The hooves are slipping. My hands are too big. Maddie looked at his massive, scarred hands. Then she looked at her own. Smaller. Thinner. Let me, Maddie said. Elias stopped. He looked at her. It's dangerous, he said. If she contracts while your arm is in there, she could break your wrist. Move, Elias, Maddie commanded. He didn't argue. He pulled back, sliding out of the way. Maddie rolled her sleeves up past her elbows. She took a breath. She reached in. It was hot, tight. She felt the shape of the foal. She felt the wrong angle of the legs. She closed her eyes, letting her sense of touch map the dark space. I have the back hocks, Maddie said, her voice tight with effort. I need to push it back in slightly to turn the hips. When I say pull, you reach in over my hands and grab the ropes I've hooked around the hooves. We pull together. On her next push, Elias nodded. He knelt right beside her. Their shoulders touched. The mare groaned. Her massive belly contracted. Now, Maddie shouted. Elias reached in. His large hands clamped over the ropes she had secured. Maddie guided the hips, finding the right angle. They pulled. It was a brutal, physical struggle. Maddie's arms screamed with pain. The mare thrashed. Elias grunted, planting his boots in the straw for leverage. With a wet tearing sound, the foal slid free. It hit the straw. It was a tangle of long legs and slick, dark hair. For a terrifying second, it didn't move. Elias grabbed a handful of dry straw and began scrubbing the foal's chest vigorously. Maddie cleared the sack from its nose. The foal gasped. A sharp, rattling breath. Then it snorted, shaking its head. Maddie fell back against the wooden wall of the stall. Her chest was heaving. Her arms were covered in afterbirth. Elias sat back on his heels. He stared at the breathing foal. Then he looked at the mare, who was lifting her head, letting out a soft, exhausted whinny toward her baby. They had done it. The storm raged outside, rattling the heavy barn doors. But inside that stall, there was only the sound of breathing. Elias looked at Maddie. He looked at her bloodied hands. He looked at her face, smudged with dirt and sweat. He reached out. His massive hand hovered for a second, then gently closed over hers. His hand was trembling. The man who had faced down a mob with a rifle without blinking was shaking. Maddie didn't pull away. She turned her hand over. She threaded her fingers through his. They sat like that in the dark. Dirty straw, no words. Just the desperate grip of two people who had just pulled life out of the jaws of death. It was the first time they had truly touched. It wasn't a romance. It was an anchor. An hour later, they had the mare and foal cleaned and blanketed. They stood by the wash basin, in the corner of the barn, washing the blood from their arms with freezing water. Elias was quiet, too quiet. The adrenaline had faded, leaving something hollow and dark in his eyes. He grabbed a towel. He dried his hands slowly. 15 years ago, Elias said to the dark wall of the barn. Maddie stopped washing. She turned to look at him. I was a silver miner in Nevada, Elias continued. His voice was hollow, distant, deep shaft, good pay. I had a wife, Hannah. She was 19. We were expecting our first. He tossed the towel onto a barrel. He leaned heavily against the wooden post. The timber supports gave way, he said. The tunnel collapsed. 13 men died instantly. I was trapped in a pocket of air, no bigger than a coffin. I was down there for 3 days in the pitch black, listening to the men around me slowly suffocate, waiting to die. Maddie S.'s heart ached. She stayed completely silent. She knew he needed to get it all out. They dug me out, Elias said. A miracle, the foreman called it. I ran the 2 miles back to town. I wanted to see my wife. I wanted to hold her. But when I got to the cabin, his voice cracked. He swallowed hard, staring at his boots. She had gone into labor the night the mine collapsed, Elias whispered. She was alone, no doctor, no midwife. She hemorrhaged. She bled to death on our bed while I was buried in the dark. Maddie closed her eyes. The pain in his voice was a physical weight in the room. The baby lived, Elias said. A little girl, Clementine. But I couldn't look at her, Maddie. Every time I looked at her, I saw the blood on the sheets. I saw the men dying in the dark. I was broken. So I wrapped my baby in a blanket, rode to my sister-in-law in Kansas, and handed her over. Then I rode up this mountain, and I never went back down. He finally looked at Maddie. His gray eyes were shattered. I'm a coward, Maddie, Elias said. I took that boy Sam in because I'm trying to buy my way out of hell. But it doesn't work. The guilt never leaves. Maddie stepped away from the basin. She walked over to him. She didn't hug him. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She looked him square in the eye. You listen to me, Elias Boone, Maddie said. Her voice was firm, unwavering. You survived a tragedy that breaks most men in half. You lost your wife. You gave your child to someone who could care for her when you knew you couldn't. That is not cowardice. That is survival. Elias shook his head. I ran away. Yes, you ran, Maddie agreed flatly. You came up this mountain thinking isolation and pain were your life sentence. You thought, if you suffered enough up here in the cold, it would make up for not being there, for Hannah. She reached out and placed her clean, cold hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. But Elias, running away is not penance, Maddie declared. The words were a lifeline thrown into deep water. Isolation is just a slow way to die. Healing is the brave choice. She held his gaze, forcing him to hear every single syllable. You think shutting the world out honors your dead wife? Maddie asked. It doesn't. Daring to face the world, choosing to feel the pain, and choosing to love, again, is the only real way to honor the people we've lost. You have a daughter out there. You have a boy in that cabin who looks at you like you hung the moon. You are not a coward, but you have to stop hiding. Elias stared at her. The wind screamed outside the barn, but between them, the air was perfectly still. A tear broke loose from the corner of the mountain man's eye. It traced a clean line down through the dirt on his cheek, into his thick beard. He didn't wipe it away. He reached up and covered her hand, which was still resting on his chest. How do you know all that? He whispered. Because I've been hiding too, Maddie said softly. But I'm done. Elias nodded, slowly. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The heavy, suffocating weight he had carried 15 years didn't vanish. Trauma doesn't work like that. But for the first time, he felt strong enough to carry it. The winter finally broke in late April. The snow didn't melt. Quietly, it tore down the mountain in muddy, rushing streams. The pine branches snapped upward, freed from the weight of the ice. The air smelled like wet dirt and pine needles. It felt like a relief. But trouble always travels faster on a dry road. It was a Tuesday. Elias was out back, mending the corral fence. Maddie was at the stove, baking bread. Sam was sitting at the table, reading out loud from an old primer. He was healthy. His cheeks were pink. The malaria was gone. Then the dog started barking. Maddie wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron. She walked to the window. A single rider was coming up the trail. He wore a tin star on his chest. It was Deputy Miller, a young man, barely 20. He looked terrified to be riding up to Elias Boone's cabin. Maddie opened the door. Elias was already walking around the side of the house. He held his hammer in one hand. He didn't look welcoming. The deputy pulled his horse up. He didn't dismount. Boone, the deputy said. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. Mrs. Boone. What do you want, Miller? Elias asked. His voice was gravel. The deputy reached into his saddlebag. His hand was shaking. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy paper, sealed with red wax. He tossed it down into the mud near Elias's boots. Summons from Judge Thaddeus Carter, the deputy said quickly. Petition filed by Dr. Silas Vance and the mayor. They're coming for the boy, Boone. They filed an emergency order to seize the orphan Samuel, claiming he's in moral and physical danger, claiming your wife is practicing witchcraft and endangering a minor. Elias stared at the paper in the mud. His face didn't change, but his grip on the hammer tightened until his knuckles turned pure white. They want to put him in the county orphanage, the deputy added, looking at Mattie. Hearing is set for tomorrow morning. If you don't show up and surrender the boy, the judge signs the warrant, and a posse comes up here to take him by force. The deputy didn't wait for a reply. He yanked his reins and spurred his horse back down the mountain. Mattie walked off the porch. She picked the paper out of the mud. She broke the seal and read it. The words were dressed in legal terms: unfit guardians, unnatural practices. But the intent was clear. It was revenge. Vance couldn't burn her garden, so he was going to take the boy she had just saved. Elias turned around. He walked straight past her. Where are you going? Mattie asked. To the barn, Elias said, to get my rifle and 100 rounds of ammunition. Mattie caught his arm. It was like grabbing a block of granite. Elias, stop, she said. He looked down at her. The cold, dead look from the night they met was back in his eyes. I told you, Elias said softly. Nobody crosses my fence. They want to fight. They'll get a war. I won't let them take the boy and lock him in a county workhouse. If you shoot a deputy, they will hang you, Mattie said. Her voice was steady, and Sam goes to the orphanage anyway. Violence won't stop this. It will just prove Vance right. Then what do we do? Elias demanded. We don't do anything, Mattie said. I do. She let go of his arm. She walked back into the cabin. She walked straight to her shelf and picked up her mother's thick leather-bound journal. She wrapped it carefully in an oilcloth. Saddle my mule, Elias, Mattie called out. I'm going down the mountain. Elias stepped into the doorway. Alone? Not a chance. Yes, alone, Mattie insisted. She put on her heavy wool coat. If you go down there with a gun, they won't hear a word we say. They'll just see a wild man. I am the one they accused. I am the one who will answer. Elias hated it. He hated every second of it. But he looked at the set of her jaw. He saw the fire in her eyes. He knew he couldn't stop her. An hour later, Mattie was riding down the muddy trail. She didn't look back. Cedarwood was bustling when she arrived. Wagons rolled through the muddy main street. People stopped on the boardwalks to stare as she rode past. The widow who married the mountain man. The witch. Whispers followed her like a trail of smoke. She tied her mule in front of the town hall. She didn't brush the mud off her skirt. She didn't adjust her hair. She held her oilcloth-wrapped journal tightly against her chest and walked through the heavy double doors. The courtroom was small. It smelled of old tobacco and lemon oil. Judge Thaddeus Carter sat behind a raised oak desk. He was a man in his 60s, with a face carved by years of making hard decisions. He looked tired. Sitting in the front row, wearing a tailored suit and a smug smile, was Dr. Silas Vance. Mayor Trenton sat beside him. Mattie walked down the center aisle. Her boots echoed on the hardwood floor. Mrs. Boone, Judge Carter said, looking up over his spectacles, I did not expect you until tomorrow. The truth doesn't need to wait until morning, Your Honor, Mattie said. She stopped in front of the judge's bench. She didn't look at Vance. She kept her eyes entirely on the man who held Sam's fate. Dr. Vance filed a petition, Judge Carter said, folding his hands. He claims you are holding a child hostage in an environment of superstition and danger. He claims you use unnatural means to practice medicine. How do you answer? Mattie unwrapped the oilcloth. She placed the heavy, leather-bound book on the judge's desk. I answer with science, Your Honor, Mattie said. Judge Carter frowned. He opened the book. He saw the detailed botanical drawings. He saw the neat, precise handwriting. This is in German, the judge said. It is, Mattie agreed. And I can translate every single page for you. That is a comprehensive study of native botany, anatomy, and pharmacology. It details exact dosages, contraindications, and physiological effects of over 100 plants. There is no magic in those pages. Only observation, only medicine. Dr. Vance stood up. His chair scraped loudly. It's a prop, Vance shouted. She's a peasant woman. She doesn't know the first thing about the human body. She brews weeds in a pot and calls it a cure. Mattie finally turned to look at Vance. The anger she had been holding back for 3 years flared bright and hot. She turned back to the judge. She stood tall. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The quiet power of her words commanded the entire room. Your Honor, Mattie said, her voice ringing clear and steady. The knowledge of folk medicine and botany is a heritage kept alive by women for generations, we observed. We learned. We passed it down when the doors of universities were bolted shut against us. Judge Carter leaned forward. He was listening. Dr. Vance calls it heresy, Mattie continued, pointing a sharp finger at the doctor. But deeming it heresy, threatening to imprison us or burn our homes, is nothing but a deliberate act to strip women of their right to contribute to humanity. It is an act of cowardice from men who fear that a woman with a root might be a better healer than a man with a scalpel. The courtroom was dead silent. Mayor Trenton looked down at his shoes. Vance was red in the face, sputtering, but he couldn't find the words to interrupt her. Mattie took a step closer to the bench. Her voice softened, but the intensity remained. They filed this petition, claiming they care about the boy, Mattie said. But that is a lie. When that child was freezing to death in the woods, the mayor didn't look for him. Dr. Vance didn't offer his warm bed. That man on the mountain, my husband, did what no one in this civilized town had the decency to do. He opened his home to a dying child. He fed him. I cured him of the malaria that was boiling his blood. She rested both her hands on the edge of the judge's desk. We saved his life, Mattie declared, and now they want to use the law to steal him away, just to punish me for bruised pride. Do not let them do this, Judge Carter. Do not use the law to punish human kindness. Mattie stepped back. She had said her piece. Judge Carter stared at her. He looked down at the book. He looked over at Dr. Vance, who was sweating through his expensive collar. I have served on this bench for 20 years, Judge Carter finally said. His voice was quiet, but it carried absolute authority. I have heard men lie. I have heard men cheat. I know the sound of a desperate soul, and I know the sound of the truth. He closed Mattie's journal. He handed it back to her. Go back to your mountain, Mrs. Boone, Judge Carter said. I will have my clerk draft my ruling tonight. I will deliver it to you personally tomorrow, Vance gasped. Your Honor, you cannot let her leave. Judge Carter slammed his wooden gavel down. The crack sounded like a gunshot. Court is adjourned, Carter barked. He leveled a furious glare at the doctor. And Dr. Vance, I highly suggest you go home and reconsider the oath you took to heal the sick, because right now the only danger to this community that I see is sitting in your chair. Mattie took her book. She wrapped it in the oilcloth. She walked down the aisle. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just walked out into the cold spring air, mounted her mule, and headed back home. She had fought the war. Now she had to wait and see if she had won. The wait was agonizing. Maddie got back to the cabin long after dark. Elias was waiting on the porch with a lantern. He didn't ask her how it went. He just took the mule's reins, looked at her face, and nodded. The next morning passed in complete silence. Elias chopped wood. He chopped enough wood to last through next winter. He was burning off the nervous energy. Maddie scrubbed the floors. She wiped down the shelves. Sam sat on the porch, whittling, sensing the heavy tension in the air. At noon, the dog barked. Elias dropped his axe. Maddie stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. A covered buggy was slowly making its way up the rocky trail, pulled by two sturdy gray horses. A man rode a saddle horse alongside it. It was Judge Thaddeus Carter. Elias stepped in front of the cabin. He rested his hand on his hip, dangerously close to his revolver. The buggy pulled into the yard and came to a halt. Judge Carter dismounted. He looked at Elias. He looked at the gun belt. "Put that away, Mr. Boone," Judge Carter said tiredly. "I am not here for the boy." Elias didn't relax, but he let his hand drop to his side. Judge Carter reached into his coat. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy paper with a gold seal. He handed it to Maddie. "The official dismissal of Dr. Vance's petition," Judge Carter said. "Signed and stamped. Samuel remains in your custody. Fully and legally." Maddie let out a breath. She felt like she'd been holding since yesterday. She closed her eyes. "Thank you, Your Honor." "Don't thank me for doing my job, Mrs. Boone," Carter said. "I held a town meeting at 8 o'clock this morning. I made sure every man and woman in Cedarwood heard my ruling." Elias crossed his arms. "What did you tell them?" Judge Carter straightened his coat. He looked out over the valley. "I read them the Riot Act," Carter said plainly. "I told them that a society that calls itself civilized cannot use hatred and fear to persecute those who nurture life. I held up the record of your wife's botanical journal. I told them it was genuine science, not witchcraft. And I made it very clear that the narrow-minded arrogance of Dr. Vance is the real poison slowly killing our community." Maddie was stunned. A judge defending her science, defending a woman's right to heal, openly. "Vance tried to argue," Carter continued, "but Mayor Trenton realized which way the wind was blowing. He publicly distanced himself from the doctor right there on the steps. Vance packed his bags. He boarded the 10 o'clock train heading east. He won't be practicing medicine in this county ever again." Elias let out a low whistle. The mountain man actually smiled. It was a rare, beautiful thing. "Well, I'll be damned," Elias said. "However," Judge Carter said, turning his attention strictly back to Elias, his tone shifted. "It grew heavy, serious. That is only half the reason I rode up this mountain today." Elias's smile vanished. "What's the other half?" Carter walked over to the buggy. He reached out and opened the small wooden door. "Step down, child," Carter said gently. A girl stepped out of the buggy. She was 14 years old. She wore a simple, faded blue dress and a heavy gray traveling cloak. She had a canvas satchel slung over her shoulder. Her hair was a messy shock of dark brown, pulled back in a loose braid, but it was her face that made the world stop spinning. She had Elias's chin, his stubborn brow, but her eyes, soft, bright, hazel, were a ghost from 15 years ago. Elias stopped breathing. He stumbled backward a half step as if he had been shot in the chest. "Hannah," Elias whispered. The name tore out of his throat, raw and bleeding. "No, sir," the girl said. Her voice was steady. It didn't shake. She looked at the giant bearded mountain man without a single ounce of fear. "My name is Clementine. Clementine Boone." Maddie covered her mouth with her hand. Elias couldn't move. He was completely paralyzed. 15 years of guilt, 15 years of hiding, had just stepped out of a buggy and into his front yard. Judge Carter looked at Maddie. She arrived on the early train from Kansas yesterday. Went straight to the sheriff's office looking for Elias Boone. She told us she read a newspaper article that got picked up in Topeka. An article about a mob chasing a witch and a mountain man who stood them down. Clementine took a step forward. Her boots crunched in the mud. "Aunt Sarah said you were dead," Clementine said to Elias, "but I saw the name in the paper. I knew it was you. So I bought a ticket. I came to see for myself." Elias fell to his knees. The man who had swung a pickaxe into frozen rock, the man who had faced down 17 torches without blinking, simply gave way. He fell into the mud. He covered his face with his massive, scarred hands. His shoulders shook. A deep, agonizing sob broke from his chest. It wasn't a sound of weakness. It was a dam breaking. It was 15 years of poison finally draining out of his soul. Clementine walked up to him. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for permission. She knelt in the mud right beside him. She reached out her small, pale hand and laid it gently on his broad, shaking shoulder. "It's all right," Clementine said softly. "I'm here now. I'm not mad at you." Maddie watched them. Tears were running freely down her own cheeks. She remembered what she had told him in the barn. Healing is the brave choice. Choosing to feel the pain is the only way to honor the dead. He was doing it. Right now. He was feeling it all. Judge Carter walked over to Maddie. He stood quietly beside her. "She's a brave girl," Carter murmured. "Just like her father. Just like her new mother." Maddie looked up at the judge. She wiped her tears away with the back of her wrist. "She has a home here," Maddie said fiercely, "as long as she wants it." Sam had walked down from the porch. He stood a few feet away, watching the crying giant and the strange girl. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew it was important. He walked over to Maddie and slipped his small hand into hers. Maddie squeezed the boy's hand. The storm was over. Dr. Vance was gone. The town's ignorance had been beaten back by the hard light of the truth. Elias slowly lowered his hands from his face. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the face of the woman he had loved, living on in the child he had abandoned. He reached out, his hands trembling violently, and pulled Clementine into a crushing embrace. The girl buried her face in his thick buckskin coat. Maddie looked out over the garden. The echinacea seeds were still sleeping under the cold earth. But the snow was melting. The sun was warm on her face. The dirt had yielded, and spring was finally here. The first wedding was a bargain made in the dark, a shield against a mob. The second wedding was in the daylight, and it was a choice. It was late May. The mountain was awake. The pines smelled like sweet sap and wet earth. The sky was a vast, unbroken blue, stretching out over the Colorado Territory like a promise. They didn't go down to the church in Cedarwood. They didn't need stained glass. They had the mountain. Judge Thaddeus Carter stood on the front porch of the cabin. He wore a clean black suit. He held a small, worn Bible. There wasn't a crowd. There didn't need to be. Clementine stood to Elias S. Right. She wore a simple yellow dress Maddie had sewn for her. Her hazel eyes were bright, free of the shadow she had carried from Kansas. Sam stood next to Maddie. He was wearing a new pair of suspenders. His hair was slicked back with water. He held a small bouquet of wild columbines he had picked from the ridge that morning. And standing near the edge of the yard, quiet and respectful, was the Cheyenne man. Tall Bear. He had ridden up the trail at dawn. He didn't speak English well, but he brought a blanket woven with deep red and blue threads, a gift for the healer who had saved his daughter S-Leg. Elias looked at Maddie. He didn't wear buckskin today. He wore a clean cotton shirt. His beard was trimmed. He looked like a man who had finally put down a heavy load. Judge Carter cleared his throat. "We are not here to satisfy the law," Carter said quietly. "The law is already satisfied. We are here to satisfy the heart, to witness two people who found each other in the roughest of times and chose to stay." The judge nodded to Elias. Elias didn't have a piece of paper. He didn't need one. He looked down at Maddie. He took her hands in his. His massive, scarred thumbs gently rubbed her knuckles. "I don't promise that the winters won't be cold," Elias said. His voice was a steady, deep rumble. "I don't promise that the mountain won't be hard, but I promise I will never run away again. I promise I will stand between you and the wind. I will look at you as the woman you are, not who the town wants you to be, not who the world expects you to be. Just you, my partner, my equal." Maddie felt a tear slip down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She squeezed his hands. "I spent my whole life hiding what I knew," Maddie said softly. Her voice carried over the quiet yard. "I thought healing others was the only way I was allowed to exist. You were the first person who told me I was allowed to heal myself. I promised to share this life with you, Elias. The dirt, the snow, and the quiet. I choose you today and every day after." Judge Carter smiled. It was a rare, genuine smile. "By the power vested in me, and by the grace of the good earth beneath our feet," Carter said, "I pronounce your vows sealed." Elias leaned down. He didn't hesitate. He kissed her. It wasn't a desperate kiss. It was deep. Sure, it was the kiss of a man who had finally come home. Sam cheered. Clementine laughed, wiping her eyes. The wind blew through the pines. It felt like the mountain was breathing with them. 2 years passed. The calendar turned to 1880. But time up on Boone Mountain wasn't measured in years. It was measured in harvests, in the height of a boy, in the thickening pages of a leather-bound book. The cabin had changed. It had grown. Elias had built an extension on the south side. Wide windows let the sun pour in. Inside, it smelled of dried mint, lavender, and sharp ginger. Heavy wooden shelves lined the walls, packed tight with glass jars. It was an apothecary, a real one. The town of Cedarwood had changed, too. After Dr. Vance left, a new doctor came from Denver. A young man. A man who quickly realized that the woman up on the ridge knew the native flora far better than any textbook he owned. People stopped whispering about the witch. Pain has a funny way of killing pride. When a man's back is throwing spasms, or his child has the croup, he doesn't care if the cure comes from a fancy office or a mountain cabin. He just wants the cure. Wagons made the trek up the trail every week now. Maddie didn't turn anyone away, but she didn't go down to them either. If they wanted her help, they came to her terms. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sun was warm. Inside the apothecary, Maddie stood at the long wooden table. Clementine stood beside her. The girl was 16 now, tall, smart as a whip. Between them lay a fresh bundle of yarrow and a mortar and pestle. Clementine was grinding the leaves. She was reading from Maddie's mother's book. She had learned German just to read it. "So, the yarrow stops the bleeding," Clementine said, looking up. "But if you use too much, it causes blistering." "Exactly," Maddie said. She leaned against the table, wiping a smudge of dirt from the girl's cheek. "Medicine is a balance, Clem. It's about knowing the line between a cure and a poison." Clementine set the pestle down. She looked out the window, down toward the valley. "A man from town told me yesterday that it's a shame I'm up here grinding weeds." Clementine said. He said a girl my age should be in a parlor learning needlepoint, getting ready to find a husband to provide for me. Mattie stopped. She turned fully toward Clementine. She looked at her stepdaughter. She saw the bright, sharp mind humming behind those hazel eyes. Listen to me, Clementine, Mattie said. Her tone was serious. It wasn't a casual chat. It was a lesson. The men down in that valley want you in a parlor because a woman in a parlor is easy to control. They tell you to find a man to provide for you because they want you to believe you cannot provide for yourself. Mattie reached out. She tapped the heavy leather cover of the medical journal. Education is not just about reading, Mattie stated clearly, making sure the girl heard every single word. Knowledge is a tool of freedom. They kept medical science and education away from women for centuries, because an educated woman doesn't need to be saved. A woman who understands the science of the earth, a woman who can read, write, and heal, holds her own fate in her hands. Clementine looked at the book. Then she looked at Mattie. You learn this earth, Clem, Mattie said softly, but firmly. You learn this science. You learn how the body works. Because when you possess your own knowledge, you never have to beg a man for your own survival. You choose a husband because you love him, never because you need him to eat. Clementine stood up a little straighter. The doubt in her eyes vanished. I understand, Clementine said. Good, Mattie smiled. Now hand me the digitalis, carefully. Late afternoon settled over the ridge. The sky turned the color of a bruised peach. The heavy thud of boots sounded on the wooden porch. Elias walked up the steps. He was carrying a broken plow blade. Sam was right behind him, carrying a heavy toolbox. Sam was 9 now. He was filling out, thick through the chest, with a quiet, steady nature. He followed Elias like a shadow. Set it by the door, Sam, Elias said. We'll fire the forge tomorrow. Need to retemper the steel. Yes, sir, Sam said. He set the box down with a heavy clatter. Mattie walked out onto the porch. She handed Elias a tin cup of hot black coffee. Elias took it. He took a sip, letting out a long, satisfied sigh. Tough dirt today? Mattie asked. Always is, Elias said, but it yields if you hit it long enough. He leaned against the wooden railing. He looked out over the front yard. The garden was massive now. Row upon row of green shoots pushing up through the dark soil. Coneflowers, foxglove, mint, and sage. It was a chaotic, beautiful sea of life. Sam ran off toward the barn to check the horses. Clementine was inside, putting the jars away. It was just the two of them on the porch. Elias reached out. He pulled Mattie close to his side. She leaned her head against his broad shoulder. He smelled like sweat, pine, and wood smoke. It was the best smell in the world. He looked down the mountain, toward the town of Cedarwood. It looked small from up here, insignificant. I was thinking about the night we met, Elias said quietly. The torches, Mattie murmured. Yeah, the torches. Elias took another sip of coffee. His gray eyes were calm, reflective. They were so sure they were right, Elias said. 17 grown men, terrified of a woman with a basket of roots, terrified of things they refused to understand. He set the tin cup down on the railing. He turned his body, looking at Mattie. He wanted to say something, something he had been chewing on all day out in the fields, something he wanted her to know he understood now. Completely. Prejudice is a loud thing, Mattie, Elias said. His voice was deliberate, steady. It can be as loud and violent as a mob with torches. It burns hot. It makes men feel powerful when they are really just weak and afraid. Mattie looked up at him. She listened. But you taught me something, Elias continued, gesturing out toward the sprawling garden of herbs. You taught me that love and knowledge and truth, they aren't loud. They are patient. They are as patient as these roots. They do the work under the dirt where nobody is looking. He reached out, his rough hand gently cupping her face. Ignorance tries to burn the world down, Elias stated clearly. But the truth will always break through the hardest, most barren minds and prevail. It just takes time. It takes courage. It takes people who are brave enough to stand in the dirt and wait for the spring. Maddie smiled, a deep, soulful smile. You're getting poetic in your old age, Elias Boone, she whispered. I'm just calling it like I see it, he said. He kissed her forehead. They stood there on the porch as the sun finally dipped below the jagged peaks of the Rockies. The air turned cold, but they didn't go inside. Not right away. They had built a fortress out of timber and truth. They had taken in the broken and the lost, and they had built a family. The mob was a memory. The witch was a myth. But the mountain man and the healer, they were real, and they weren't going anywhere. This channel is dedicated to rich and emotional Western storytelling, cowboy legends, frontier romance, stories of motherhood, sacrifice, hope, and the timeless compassion between human beings. The heart of this story teaches us that real strength comes from protecting others, even when the world stands against you. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.
When the dust finally settled over that cold mountain cabin, what remained was not just the story of a widow, a cowboy, and a forgotten child. It was the story of what happens when courage stands against fear, when compassion refuses to bow before hatred, and when broken people choose to heal instead of hide. Maddie's journey reminds us that wisdom is not always found in grand offices, polished titles, or the approval of powerful men. Sometimes true wisdom lives in calloused hands, in quiet gardens, in a mother's old journal, and in the heart of someone brave enough to care when everyone else turns away. This story teaches us that kindness is never weakness. In a world where people are often judged by fear, pride, skin color, gender, poverty, or the mistakes of the past, Maddie and Elias show us a different way. They remind us that every human life has value. A sick child deserves healing. A wounded stranger deserves mercy. A woman's knowledge deserves respect. And a man carrying grief deserves the chance to begin again. The greatest strength in the West was not always found in a gun or a clenched fist, but in the courage to protect the helpless, speak the truth, and open your heart after pain has tried to close it forever. Elias Boone thought isolation was his punishment, but love taught him that hiding from the world is not the same as honoring the dead. Maddie Hayes thought she had to survive alone, but compassion led her to a family she never expected. Together, they proved that family is not always born from blood. Sometimes, family is built through sacrifice, loyalty, forgiveness, and the simple promise that no one will be abandoned again. And that is the true meaning of this Western tale. Ignorance may gather with torches, but truth has a way of standing taller in the dark. Pride may try to bury goodness, but compassion keeps taking root, like seeds beneath the winter snow. So may we all learn from Maddie, Elias, and Sam to judge less, to care more, to defend those who cannot defend themselves, and to believe that even the hardest hearts can soften when touched by mercy. If this story moved you, let it stay with you beyond this final scene. Carry its message into your own life. Choose kindness when others choose cruelty. Choose courage when others choose silence, and never underestimate the healing power of one compassionate heart. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed this story, please leave a comment, share it with someone who loves meaningful Western tales, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of cowboys, frontier love, motherhood, sacrifice, mercy, and the timeless bond between human beings on the rugged roads of the Old West.